Hey guys, tonight we're taking a trip back in time to ancient Rome, a world where trash wasn't just tossed aside like today. Imagine the streets filled with the bustling of thousands of Romans, their feet slapping against cobbled roads, the distant chatter of merchants selling their wares. But with all this life, there was a problem. What to do with the mountains of waste that came with a growing population? You probably won't survive the waste-strewn streets, so let's step lightly into this strange ancient world where recycling wasn't just a modern fad, it was a matter of survival. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, why not drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments? Let's see how far this journey travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ancient Rome was a wonder of engineering, art, and political savvy. But like every great civilization, it had its challenges, and one of them was waste. As the empire grew, so did the garbage. Whether it was the food scraps from an all-day feast or the shattered pottery left behind after a party, the Romans were no stranger to accumulating piles of trash. But unlike today, where we tend to stick our trash in bins and forget about it, the Romans had no choice but to deal with it creatively. You can almost hear the soft scraping of pots being reused, or the crunch of glass being melted down for a new purpose. Historians still argue whether waste disposal was more of a civic duty or a necessity driven by Rome's growing population. But either way, the Romans didn't just throw their trash away, they turned it into treasure. In the absence of a modern waste management system, necessity became the mother of invention, and the Romans found ingenious ways to repurpose everything. Glass bottles, broken tiles, scrap metal, they all found new life in the hands of skilled artisans, craftsmen, and even builders. And the best part, it wasn't just about practicality. This recycling was integrated into their art, their tools, and even their homes, making ancient Rome a place where waste was considered a resource. Imagine the scene. You're walking through the bustling streets of Rome, and you can see the debris from the day's hustle being scooped up, ready to be transformed. Broken pottery isn't discarded, no, it's crushed and reused to create new vessels. Metal scraps, remelted and forged into tools, jewelry, and statues. This wasn't just recycling for the sake of saving money, it was about preserving a society that couldn't afford to waste anything. So, what did this Roman garbage problem look like? Well, in the first place, it wasn't just a messy issue, it was an opportunity. The sheer volume of waste and the need for new materials led to the birth of what we now call recycling. The very idea of repurposing materials wasn't a modern invention. It was happening in the heart of one of history's most influential empires. Now that you've got a sense of the city, let's dive into the practical side of Roman recycling. Romans didn't just turn a blind eye to their waste problem. They actively sought ways to turn it into valuable materials. And we're not talking about just sweeping the streets clean and calling it a day. No, they got creative. They turned their trash into something useful, which might just make you rethink the next time you toss out a broken mug. Glass was one of the materials that the Romans were especially skilled at recycling. In fact, The Romans were among the first in the world to make glass on a wide scale. This was a luxury material for them, often used in windows, bottles, and decorations. But as you can imagine, glass doesn't exactly come cheap in the ancient world. So when a piece of glass was damaged or broken, the Romans didn't just toss it out. They melted it down, refashioned it, and made something entirely new. Picture yourself as a Roman craftsman, carefully heating a glass shard over an open flame, turning it back into something beautiful and functional. It's a scene not too different from a modern-day artisan reworking a piece of scrap metal. Historians still debate exactly when the Romans truly perfected glassblowing, but the general consensus is that by the 1st century BCE, they had mastered the technique. The method allowed them to melt down broken glassware and recycle it into new items, drastically reducing waste. However, it wasn't always perfect. Sometimes the glass would come out with imperfections like bubbles or discoloration. Still, these pieces were often deemed charming, giving Roman glassware a distinctive rustic character that collectors would appreciate today. But glass wasn't the only material that got a second chance in Rome. The recycling of metal was even more prevalent, and the Romans were particularly keen on reusing their precious metals. Iron, bronze, and copper were commonly melted down and reforged into tools, coins, and even art pieces. Imagine a blacksmith at his forge, a steady hum of heat rising from the furnace as he melts down scrap metal, carefully shaping it into something that will be used again and again. It's like an ancient version of modern-day scrapyards, but with a bit more artistry involved. Romans also had a way of reclaiming metal from old weapons or statues, melting them down and reusing the metal to make something new. But it wasn't just about practicality, it was also a matter of prestige. In fact, reusing metal was seen as a symbol of Roman ingenuity. As Rome grew in power, they were keen to showcase not just their military prowess, but their ability to handle resources effectively. And here's the thing, much of this recycling wasn't something that happened quietly behind the scenes. In fact, there were entire industries built around repurposing materials. For instance, certain parts of the Roman Empire had specialized workshops that exclusively dealt with glass or metal recycling. These craftsmen and women would take broken or discarded items and through a process of melting, molding, and reworking, they would give them new lives. Historians still argue whether these workshops were purely functional or if they also served an artistic purpose, but one thing's for sure, the Romans knew how to get the most out of their materials. In a city as grand as Rome, where space and resources were limited, throwing away anything, whether it was broken glass or scrap metal, just wasn't an option. They saw value in everything, and that mindset trickled down into their day-to-day lives. You can imagine the steady hum of these workshops, the smell of burning metal, the clink of hammers striking anvils. It's almost as if the city's refuse was being transformed into something magical, a process that happened all around you every day. Imagine walking down the street and catching a glimpse of a craftsman hammering away at a discarded bronze statue, reshaping it into something useful, something new. But while glass and metal were being reworked into art and tools, the Romans didn't stop there. Pottery, too, had a second life in ancient Rome, and we're about to dive into how they handled that next. You're still walking down the vibrant, bustling streets of ancient Rome, and you happen upon a potter's workshop. The rhythmic sound of a wheel turning fills the air as a craftsman shapes a new piece of pottery from the clay that was so abundant in the region. But this isn't just a new piece being made from scratch. No, what you're witnessing is another example of Roman ingenuity. Those broken shards of pottery you see scattered around the floor, they're not trash. They're part of something new. In ancient Rome, pottery was a big deal. You could walk into almost any Roman home and find a variety of ceramic pieces, bowls, plates, jars, and storage containers, all made from fired clay. But not all pottery was crafted from fresh clay. In fact, Romans were masters at reusing their ceramic scraps, turning broken pots and vases into new works of art. This wasn't just a cost-saving measure. It was part of their culture. The Romans understood that resources were finite, so they weren't about to let a few broken bits of pottery go to waste. Instead, they collected them and either melted them down or repurposed them into new forms. Historians still argue whether the recycling of pottery was more practical or artistic, but one thing is certain. This was an essential part of Roman life. When a pottery piece broke, instead of tossing it away, the pieces would be gathered up and either crushed into a fine powder to be mixed into new clay, or, in some cases, used as raw material for mosaics. The idea of making mosaics out of broken pottery is one that truly demonstrates how the Romans saw trash as treasure. These mosaics weren't just a way to reuse broken pieces. They were often works of stunning artistic detail. You might find the remains of an old bowl or jug incorporated into a vibrant pattern of tiles on the floor of a wealthy Roman villa, or even as a part of the decoration in a public bathhouse. Pottery didn't have to be perfect to have value. It only had to be useful, whether it was for everyday function or as a decorative feature. And while some pottery was being crushed down into mosaic tiles, other fragments were simply repurposed into new jars or storage vessels. Imagine the efficiency of this process. You're living in ancient Rome, where the streets are busy, the homes are filled with guests, and every broken jar or dish can still have a purpose. That chipped drinking cup, don't throw it out. It could be melted down and reformed into something new, saving resources and keeping the cycle of reuse going. It's a mindset that modern societies could learn a thing or two from, don't you think? Beyond just practical reasons, the Romans had a very specific approach to material reuse, even when it came to the artistic integrity of the items. A cracked piece of pottery could still become part of something valuable, and when it was melted down or refashioned, it was often given a new purpose in a home, public space, or temple. The same is true for materials like glass and metal. The imperfection wasn't seen as a flaw, but as part of the larger Roman system of making the most of everything available. Imagine walking into a home in ancient Rome and admiring the intricate, vibrant mosaics underfoot, many of which were made from the very scraps that had once served as household containers. Even in the wealthiest of households, recycled pottery pieces were used in this way. It's not about cutting corners. It's about utilizing every piece of the puzzle and making sure nothing goes to waste. You might even find these mosaics outside, lining the streets in front of shops, providing a beautiful yet functional layer of design to the public space. The ancient Roman knack for reusing pottery didn't just stop at making new containers or decorative elements, though. Pottery was also essential for the construction of roads and buildings. The Romans were among the first to recycle broken pottery into the building material for roads and other infrastructure. When the empire needed new structures, old pottery often found a second life as aggregate in concrete, adding to the strength and durability of Roman buildings. You can almost picture a Roman construction site where discarded pottery was crushed into small pieces, mixed with lime, and used to create the firm foundations for roads that would last centuries. By now you're beginning to see just how deeply the practice of reusing materials ran through Roman society. Whether it was glass, metal, or pottery, waste was something the Romans didn't simply discard. They transformed it. It was a process that was integral to Roman life, providing the city with an efficiency that modern recycling plants could only dream of. As we move forward in our story, it's time to look at another curious aspect of Roman recycling: how they found ways to reuse organic materials, including food scraps and even animal waste, which may sound a bit strange but was a vital part of the empire's self-sustaining systems. By now, you're starting to get a sense of just how resourceful the Romans were when it came to reusing materials like glass, pottery, and metal. But as we step deeper into their world, let's look at something a bit less glamorous, something that most people might not associate with recycling: animal waste and food scraps. To some, this might sound a bit gross, but to the Romans, it was just another part of their efficient and practical lifestyle. If anything could be used, they would use it. Let's start with animal waste. The Romans were no strangers to having livestock. From horses to cows, goats to sheep, animals played an essential role in Roman agriculture and everyday life. But with animals comes waste, and the Romans had a clever way of dealing with it. Their cities weren't exactly the pristine urban centers you might imagine. The streets were often covered with the detritus of everyday life, human refuse, food scraps, and yes, animal droppings. So what did the Romans do about it? Well, they found ways to turn this waste into something useful. In the countryside, manure was a highly valuable resource. It was used to fertilize crops, keeping Roman agriculture as efficient as possible. But the real magic happened when the waste didn't just go into the fields. It was also put to use in some of the Roman city's most essential processes. One of the best examples of this is how manure was used in Roman bathhouses. You might be wondering, how on earth could manure play a role in the luxurious world of Roman baths? The answer lies in the bathhouses' heating systems. Ancient Roman bathhouses were incredibly advanced for their time, using a complex system of heated floors, the hypocast system, to warm up the water and the rooms. But keeping the bathhouses warm required an intense source of fuel. This is where animal manure came in. The Romans often used dried animal waste, especially from horses and cows, as a primary fuel for these bathhouse furnaces. In fact, historians suggest that without the use of manure as a fuel source, many Roman bathhouses simply wouldn't have been able to maintain the level of heat they needed to keep up with demand. This may seem like a very Rome in the raw kind of recycling, but it was remarkably effective. The waste didn't just go to waste. It powered a major aspect of Roman daily life. ensuring the citizens had access to the famed Roman baths. And while it might not sound like the most glamorous aspect of Roman culture, it was certainly one of the most practical. In a society that prided itself on public works and infrastructure, reusing waste for fuel was just another way to make sure everything ran smoothly. Historians still debate the extent of manure's role in Roman life, especially within the urban centers. Some even argue that Romans in the cities were less reliant on animal waste for heating and instead turned to wood and other fuels. But given the sheer size and demand for bathhouses, many scholars believe that manure was indeed an integral part of maintaining the warmth that the Romans so greatly valued. And let's face it, they didn't have the luxury of modern power plants or natural gas, so using manure was a pretty clever workaround. But while manure was essential for heating, it didn't stop there. The ancient Romans also made use of food scraps in interesting ways. With such a large population, the Romans were constantly producing and consuming food. A feast could generate an enormous amount of waste, from leftover vegetables to scraps of meat. The Romans weren't known for wasting food, though. Instead, much of this waste was carefully collected and put to use. A large portion of food waste was fed to livestock. Cows, pigs, chickens, anything that could eat it benefited from the leftovers. In fact, ancient Roman farmers were well versed in feeding their animals not just with grass or grain, but with food scraps. In some ways, it was a simple yet highly effective form of recycling. The waste didn't end up in a landfill, because there really weren't landfills to speak of. It was repurposed as feed for the animals that would later serve the empire in the form of meat, milk, or even labor. In cities, things were a bit more complicated. While it wasn't feasible to have livestock grazing the streets of Rome, food scraps still found a second life. Often, urban dwellers would discard their food scraps in designated pits, where they would be either repurposed or taken to local farms outside the city. The system was far from perfect, but it worked. And again, the Romans' practical mindset made sure nothing went to waste. Historians still debate the true efficiency of Rome's food waste management systems, as we might imagine them, especially when it came to urban waste in the largest cities. The lack of formal trash collection meant that food waste had to be dealt with in a variety of ways. But one thing is clear. Whether it was animal waste or food scraps, the Romans knew how to recycle. It wasn't just about saving money or resources. It was about creating a sustainable system that could support a growing empire. So, next time you toss a potato peel or a bit of bread, just think, the Romans would have found a way to make sure it didn't go to waste. Maybe they'd have fed it to a chicken, or perhaps it would have found its way into a mosaic. Either way, the ancient Romans certainly had their priorities straight when it came to reducing waste and reusing what they had. And now, with these new insights into Roman recycling, it's time to move on to the next part of our story, how the Romans managed to recycle the very buildings they lived in. Now, as you stroll through the ancient Roman streets, you might notice something that's a bit different from the usual pile of broken pottery or discarded scraps. Something much larger. Look around. That old building you're standing near, it might have been repurposed too. Yes, the Romans were so resourceful that they didn't just recycle their everyday materials. they also gave new life to entire structures, transforming old buildings into something fresh and functional. Now that's a level of recycling that's hard to top. The concept of recycling buildings was a widespread practice in Rome, particularly as the empire expanded and grew more crowded. Structures, whether temples, homes, or even older public buildings, would be deconstructed and reused. Instead of letting a building sit and deteriorate over time, the Romans found ways to salvage the bricks, stones, and other materials, which would then be repurposed for new construction projects. Just imagine, you're walking through the ruins of Rome, but those very ruins are filled with the remains of older structures that were once rebuilt, reused, and transformed. The Romans weren't just preserving their history, they were recycling it, giving their world new layers, new uses, and a future that lasted for centuries. And now, let's pause for a second and reflect on the sheer magnitude of this recycling culture. We often think of recycling as a modern practice, something we've only really embraced in the last few decades. But here we are, back in ancient Rome, where entire structures were repurposed, where stone and brick had a second life, and where broken pottery wasn't just discarded, it was given new purpose in art, architecture, and even everyday life. It's a testament to the ingenuity of the Romans, who saw potential in everything around them. But before we move on to explore the more industrial aspects of Roman recycling, it's important to recognize just how much these practices influenced the development of Roman cities. In a place like Rome, where space was tight and resources were limited, every inch of material was precious. Old stone, broken glass, crumbling pottery, it didn't matter. These were not signs of waste. They were opportunities. Opportunities to build, to create, and to sustain an empire that would become one of the most influential civilizations in history. So, as you look at the ancient ruins of Rome, whether it's a crumbling temple or the remnants of a once grand villa, remember this: you're not just seeing the past, you're seeing the future of recycling, long before the term even existed. The Romans didn't just preserve their history, they recycled it, giving their world new layers, new uses, and a future that lasted for centuries. And now, as we turn to explore how the Romans tackled some of their waste through more systematic urban planning, we'll see how even the most mundane parts of daily life had their place in the empire's grand recycling system. As you continue your walk through ancient Rome, you might find yourself entering one of the city's public spaces, maybe a bustling market square or a busy forum. The air is thick with the scent of spices and freshly baked bread, while merchants shout to attract customers, and the sounds of children playing echo in the background. But what's often overlooked amid the vibrant life of the city is something that's happening just beneath the surface, something that made Roman urban planning remarkably sophisticated: waste management. Now, before you picture a Roman street full of piles of rubbish and the occasional unfortunate soul slipping on a discarded fish head, let's pause and look at the facts. Romans were surprisingly forward-thinking when it came to managing their refuse. Sure, it wasn't the most glamorous aspect of life in the ancient world, but it was an essential one, and they had a system that worked. It's a far cry from the chaotic streets we often imagine, Historians still debate just how organized Roman waste management really was, especially when it came to the cities outside of Rome. But in the capital, the Romans had established a surprisingly well-organized approach to getting rid of their waste. Every household, every shop, every building had a role to play in keeping the streets clean, or at least as clean as could be expected in a busy metropolis. The Romans would regularly collect waste, from food scraps to broken household items, and send it off to be either recycled or repurposed. The system wasn't entirely perfect, but compared to many other ancient civilizations, it was remarkably efficient. You see, ancient Rome had designated areas for waste disposal, and in some places they even had separate channels for different types of waste. For example, organic waste, like food scraps and animal byproducts, was usually sent to compost heaps or used as fertilizer in nearby fields. This was a far cry from the just throw everything in a pile method we sometimes associate with ancient civilizations. The Romans understood that organic materials had value and that they could benefit their agricultural system. But beyond just food waste, the Romans had a clever way of dealing with less than pleasant refuse. The material that didn't decompose, things like broken pottery, glass, and even old building materials, was often taken to designated dump sites or landfills on the outskirts of the city. These waste disposal sites were crucial to keeping the streets clean, preventing the waste from accumulating in the heart of Rome. The Romans didn't simply let their garbage pile up. They created entire systems designed to ensure that the waste didn't get in the way of everyday life. And when it came to dealing with the waste that was too toxic or difficult to recycle, such as human waste, the Romans had yet another solution. They developed the famous Roman sewer system, which became one of the most advanced sanitation systems in the ancient world. The Cloaca Maxima, one of Rome's oldest and most well-known sewers, was a marvel of engineering, designed to carry waste out of the city and keep the streets free of human excrement. Historians still argue whether the Roman sewers were as effective as we might imagine, with some suggesting that they were more symbolic than fully functional. However, there's no denying that these systems, which included both public latrines and private household drains, contributed to the cleanliness and livability of Roman cities. While it wasn't perfect, this infrastructure helped prevent disease and kept the streets cleaner than many other ancient civilizations managed. But the Romans didn't stop there when it came to keeping their city clean. Waste management wasn't just about keeping the streets free from unpleasant smells or ensuring that people didn't slip in garbage. It was also a way to maintain order in a growing empire. The Romans' emphasis on urban planning meant that public spaces, like the market or the bathhouses, could function efficiently, with minimal disruption from waste piling up. Rome was an empire built on infrastructure, and even waste management became an important part of that. As you picture the bustling city of Rome now, with its crowded forums, busy marketplaces, and grand bathhouses, imagine the unseen systems that kept everything running smoothly. Behind the scenes, the Romans were using their knowledge of materials and their clever recycling methods to maintain a level of cleanliness and order that many cities today could only dream of. They didn't just create a waste disposal system, they created a sustainable urban environment. As we move forward, we'll start to see how some of the waste that the Romans couldn't reuse was ultimately discarded. What happened to all the things that were simply too far gone for recycling? Well, just like everything else, the Romans had a solution for that too. It wasn't perfect, but it was as effective as they could make it. And surprisingly, some of the ways they dealt with waste would have a lasting impact on the empire, helping to ensure that Rome's reputation for cleanliness and efficiency lived on for centuries. As we continue our journey through the organized chaos of ancient Rome, let's step away from the sophisticated systems of recycling and waste management for a moment to examine what happened to all the things that simply couldn't be repurposed or recycled. Yes, even in ancient Rome there was waste that couldn't be salvaged or reused in any meaningful way. And while the Romans were remarkably resourceful, they still had to face the reality of dealing with things that had no further use. So, where did all that refuse go? Well, there were landfills. And not just any landfills, but ancient Roman dump sites that tell us a great deal about the society's practices and attitude toward trash. Imagine yourself standing on the outskirts of Rome, just beyond the city walls. The bustling streets and grand buildings seem a world away as you arrive at a large designated dumping area, perhaps an old quarry or a patch of unused land that's been converted into a giant trash heap. This wasn't a place where anyone would stroll casually, but instead it was where unwanted and unusable waste from the city would gather. The Roman Empire was enormous, and with it came a tremendous volume of refuse, everything from broken pottery to old shoes to the remains of animal slaughter. In a world without modern trash trucks, the waste had to go somewhere. The Romans had designated places for their garbage, places that became increasingly important as the population swelled and more waste was generated. These landfills were often located outside of the city, away from the public eye, but not too far away to be inconvenient. At the same time, these areas were carefully managed to avoid the creation of health hazards, something that was surprisingly ahead of its time. Historians are still fascinated by the strategic placement and management of Roman waste disposal sites, especially considering how large these dumps would grow. One particularly famous example is the Monte Testaccio in Rome, a massive hill created entirely from broken pottery shards. It's a fascinating sight because while it was a landfill, it also represents the Romans' clever way of dealing with waste. Instead of simply letting broken pottery pile up and rot away, they compacted it into a massive mound that over centuries would become a monumental part of the city's history. The Mountain of Shards, which still stands today, is a testament to the fact that the Romans didn't see broken pottery as garbage. They saw it as something that could be gathered, organized, and even displayed. Monte Testaccio's existence raises a fascinating question. Why would the Romans go to the trouble of creating such a massive landfill just for pottery? Was it a matter of convenience, or did they see it as a symbolic storage for discarded materials? Some historians believe that the sheer size of the pile reflects the Romans' understanding of the value of ceramic materials. Pottery was essential in Roman daily life, used for everything from storing food to serving drinks, so broken pieces were seen as valuable in their own right. Rather than simply throwing them away, the Romans stored them all in one place, where they could either be recycled later or remembered as a piece of Roman history. But while Monte Testaccio might be the most famous example, it wasn't the only landfill in the empire. In fact, waste disposal was such an integral part of Roman life that smaller dumps and landfills existed throughout the empire's vast cities. These sites often contained not just broken pottery, but also remnants of building materials, broken tools, and discarded objects that couldn't be reused. It's fascinating to think that these piles of refuse have, over time, become an archaeological gold mine. Excavations of ancient Roman dump sites have provided scholars with insights into the everyday lives of Romans, from the kinds of foods they ate to the tools they used. It wasn't just the pottery and discarded materials that were tossed aside, though. Even things like animal remains and spoiled food had to be dealt with, and the Romans had systems for that too. Although much of this waste was used as fertilizer or animal feed, some of it was simply discarded in these dumps. In fact, ancient Romans even had specific areas designated for the disposal of bones and other organic waste, ensuring that the city's streets remained as clean as possible. While the waste management system may not have been as perfect as modern systems, it certainly helped to mitigate the worst effects of an ever-expanding urban population. Historians are still debating how effective the Roman landfill systems truly were. Was it just a matter of containing waste in large heaps, or did the Romans have some kind of method for recycling everything they could? What's fascinating is that the idea of landfills in ancient Rome wasn't just about getting rid of things, it was about organizing refuse in a way that it didn't pollute the rest of the environment. This was crucial in a city like Rome, where the population was constantly growing and waste management had to keep up. Now let's turn our focus to another aspect of Roman waste: the ways they managed things like human waste and sewage, areas of sanitation that were just as essential as recycling and refuse removal. You might not be surprised to learn that Romans were deeply invested in the cleanliness of their cities, as public health was of great importance. In fact, this focus on sanitation would be another Roman innovation that would lay the groundwork for future generations. As we leave the dump sites and begin looking at the Romans' most impressive waste management achievement, perhaps even one of their greatest inventions, the cloaca maxima, you can almost hear the rush of water flowing through ancient sewers, quietly carrying waste away from the city's streets. Let's explore how this engineering marvel not only helped keep the city clean, but also served as an early example of urban infrastructure at its finest. Now, as we step deeper into the heart of Roman ingenuity, let's shift our focus from the landfills and dump sites to one of the most remarkable achievements in ancient Roman engineering: the sewer system. While we've already seen how waste was managed above ground, what made Roman sanitation systems stand out, especially in the city of Rome itself, was their ability to transport waste out of sight, literally, and into a far-reaching network of sewers. The Cloaca Maxima, or the Great Drain, stands as the crowning achievement of Roman public health infrastructure, a feat of engineering that would leave modern cities jealous. Picture yourself now in the bustling streets of ancient Rome. The markets are lively, the public baths are steaming with activity, and the dense crowds are everywhere. But amid all the bustle, there's something happening just below your feet, a hidden network of tunnels designed not just to deal with the city's waste, but to prevent it from overflowing onto the streets. Built as early as the 6th century BCE, the Cloaca Maxima was an incredibly advanced system for its time. As you walk through the city, you might never notice it. These tunnels were designed to keep waste moving silently beneath the streets, away from the public eye, yet making sure the city could function without the threat of disease that could easily arise from a stagnant mess of refuse. Historians still debate the true extent of the Roman sewer system's effectiveness, but there's no doubt that it was a massive improvement over what other ancient civilizations had. Before the Cloaca Maxima, many cities simply discarded waste into the streets or threw it into nearby bodies of water. But the Romans understood that a growing city needed something more sophisticated. The Cloaca Maxima was designed to carry water, waste, and even rainwater out of the city and into the Tiber River, keeping everything running smoothly, cleanly, and without the risk of contamination. Built with stone and brick, this incredible engineering marvel was a masterpiece of Roman urban planning. The network connected public latrines, homes, baths, and even some of the grandest Roman temples, all of which fed into the sewers. It was a system that essentially transformed waste management into an invisible service, something so effective that after centuries of use, parts of the Cloaca Maxima are still in operation today. Can you imagine standing on a bridge in Rome today, walking over the very same system that was used by the ancient Romans to keep their streets clean? It's not just a relic, it's a living piece of Roman history. But the Cloaca Maxima wasn't the only part of the Roman sewer system. The city had an entire network of smaller interconnected drains that worked together to carry waste away from populated areas. These drains were dug at slight inclines, which allowed waste and water to flow naturally through the system, powered by gravity. The Romans were keen on using the natural landscape to their advantage, utilizing the Tiber River to carry the waste away and ensuring that the city's sanitation didn't depend on manual labor or constant oversight. This reliance on natural forces like gravity and water currents was not only efficient, but also a testament to the Romans' engineering mastery. The creation of these sewers also speaks volumes about Roman society's commitment to public health. A clean city was a healthy city, and the Romans understood that sanitation wasn't just about tidiness, it was about survival. While they didn't know the science behind germs and bacteria, the Romans intuitively understood that waste needed to be removed from urban areas to prevent diseases like dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses. By efficiently removing waste from the city, they helped to mitigate these risks, ensuring that the empire could continue to thrive. The Roman sewers also served a very practical function. As any historian will tell you, public health was a cornerstone of Roman success, and the sewer system played a huge role in that. Public bathhouses, latrines, and even fountains, all of these systems required the removal of waste to function properly. The Romans were extremely forward-thinking in their approach to urban planning, and they understood that a city that didn't prioritize waste removal was a city on the brink of collapse. Still, it wasn't all smooth sailing for the Roman sewer systems. As you can imagine, a network this vast required constant maintenance. Over time, sediment would build up and the sewers could get clogged with debris. In fact, the Romans were known to have a specialized workforce for maintaining the sewers. Slaves and workers who would clean out the pipes and keep everything functioning. This maintenance was essential to ensuring that the system didn't fail, and it shows just how deeply the Romans understood the importance of keeping their city clean. Beyond just maintaining the Cloaca Maxima, the Romans also took great care in managing the flow of water, especially when it came to their public bathhouses. If you recall our earlier discussion about the use of animal manure as a fuel source for heating bathhouses, you'll see how important the efficient movement of water was to Roman daily life. It wasn't just about removing waste, it was about keeping water flowing smoothly to power the baths and other amenities. So, as we look at the grandeur of ancient Rome, it's easy to get lost in the impressive architecture, the towering columns, and the opulent bathhouses. But don't forget to look down. Below your feet, beneath the grand structures, flows the unsung hero of Roman urban life, the sewers. Without this system, Rome would not have been able to flourish as it did. The Cloaca Maxima and its network of drains were essential to the health and longevity of the empire, and their impact can still be seen in modern cities today. And now that we've explored the Roman sewer system, we're ready to turn our attention to the unexpected luxury of Roman recycling, how even the most mundane, everyday trash could find its way into the hands of artisans, creating beautiful and unexpected works of art. As we continue our journey through the ancient city of Rome, we shift gears once more, this time to a surprising and somewhat luxurious side of Roman recycling. While we've discussed the everyday practicality of reusing broken pottery, discarded metal, and even animal waste, there's another facet of Roman life where trash was given a glamorous second life. That's right. Even the most mundane, everyday garbage, items you might think of as purely waste, was often transformed into beautiful, valuable luxury goods. The Romans had a unique way of elevating their recycling to an art form, turning trash into treasures that were highly sought after in both Roman society and beyond. Imagine you're walking through the bustling markets of Rome. The smell of fresh fish and fruits wafts through the air as merchants offer their goods, and you hear the lively chatter of buyers and sellers haggling over prices. Amid this chaos, you spot something curious in one of the stalls, a glittering necklace made from what looks like pieces of broken glass. The merchant is telling a potential customer that it's a one-of-a-kind piece crafted from recycled materials, and in ancient Rome, such items were considered a mark of wealth and status. Broken glass? Used pottery shards? What was once discarded trash had now been transformed into a stunning piece of jewelry. Historians still debate how common these types of luxury recycled goods were in Roman society. While many of these pieces have been uncovered in archaeological digs, it's clear that the idea of turning everyday waste into objects of beauty was deeply ingrained in Roman culture. This wasn't just a matter of practicality. This was about creating something with historical significance. The value wasn't just in the materials themselves, but in the way the Romans were able to take what was considered junk and elevate it to a status symbol. The most famous example of this kind of luxury recycling involved the use of broken glass, often repurposed into jewelry. Romans were skilled in turning fragments of glass into beads, pendants, and decorative items. While glass was initially a luxury material, it wasn't just the wealthy who could afford to wear it. Craftspeople could take even the most broken pieces of glass and melt them down to create new, shimmering accessories that could be worn with pride. These glass pieces were often brightly colored and could be made into intricate designs, something that would have been prized in Roman society. But glass wasn't the only material to receive this kind of second life. The Romans also made use of broken pottery in the creation of decorative objects. If a pot, jug, or vase was cracked or chipped, it wasn't immediately discarded. Instead, the pieces might be reworked into mosaic patterns, adorning the floors and walls of wealthy Roman homes. The Romans had a penchant for mosaics, and they often used shards of broken pottery, recycled and transformed into intricate designs that served as both artistic decoration and a demonstration of their skills in repurposing materials. These mosaics would often feature images of gods, heroes, and mythological scenes, and the use of discarded pottery was a clever way to reuse valuable materials. You might also find fragments of old ceramic dishes or bowls that had been broken and then cleverly integrated into furniture. Some Roman chairs, for example, were decorated with pieces of brightly colored pottery that had been meticulously arranged into patterns, giving even mundane furniture an artistic flair. It wasn't just the wealthy who had access to these repurposed materials. Artisans were able to make these items affordable for the everyday Roman citizen, elevating what would have been trash into something beautiful and functional. Now, let's think about this from a broader perspective. In a society that prided itself on progress, innovation, and grandeur, the Romans didn't just throw things away. They found ways to keep the old alive, to repurpose materials that might have been deemed useless elsewhere. This tendency to recycle, especially when it came to creating luxury goods, wasn't just a necessity, it was a reflection of Roman values. The Romans understood that the past had value, and they were deeply invested in the idea that even the remnants of a former age could be used to create something of lasting worth. This mindset of transformation and renewal extended not just to physical materials, but to the culture itself. The legacy of ancient Rome was about more than just its physical structures. It was about how the Romans continually found ways to take the old and make it new again. Historians still argue whether this widespread use of recycled luxury goods was purely driven by necessity, or if it was tied to a larger cultural shift. Was it simply about reducing waste and being resourceful? Or was there a deeper philosophical message being communicated? After all, when a piece of broken glass was transformed into a necklace, or a broken jug became a mosaic, it wasn't just a functional process. It was a statement about beauty, creativity, and Roman resilience. Now, you might be wondering what happened to all these luxury items, these recycled treasures. Well, they didn't just stay in the homes of wealthy Romans. The practice of crafting jewelry, pottery, and mosaics from recycled materials spread throughout the empire, becoming a hallmark of Roman craftsmanship. These items were highly prized and often sold as luxury goods in markets far beyond Rome itself. Traders would travel across the empire, bringing these fine items to other parts of the Mediterranean, where they would be admired for their craftsmanship and ingenuity. In this way, even Rome's trash didn't just stay confined to its city walls. It was reimagined and sent out into the world, carrying with it the legacy of Roman creativity and resourcefulness. And as we reflect on the surprising elegance that came from the Roman practice of recycling, we move on to examine how this legacy, this ability to turn waste into beauty, left an imprint on later civilizations, influencing art, culture, and even modern recycling efforts. As we approach the final chapters of our journey through Roman recycling and resourcefulness, let's zoom out a bit and consider the larger picture. The Roman Empire wasn't just a marvel of engineering, architecture, and warfare. It was a society that understood, perhaps better than many of their contemporaries, that waste was not just a byproduct of civilization, but an opportunity to create, to innovate, and to preserve. When you step back and look at the entire Roman Empire, from the bustling streets of Rome to the remote corners of the provinces, it becomes clear that recycling wasn't just a niche practice, it was ingrained into the very fabric of Roman life. The Romans' ability to reuse, repurpose, and transform what others might have seen as waste helped fuel the empire's longevity and success. Think about it. From the grandest marble columns to the smallest broken shards of pottery, everything had a role to play. Waste wasn't hidden away in some far-off corner. It was incorporated into public life, art, and infrastructure. There's something profoundly sustainable about this, isn't there? It's a reflection of the Roman mindset that saw nothing as truly disposable. Whether it was turning broken glass into luxurious jewelry or reusing bricks and stone from ancient buildings to create new temples, the Romans always found a way to keep their resources circulating. The sheer scale of this practice is staggering. Imagine the enormous network of roads stretching across the empire, from the heart of Rome to the farthest reaches of Britain, Spain, and Africa. These roads weren't built with new materials alone. Old bricks, stone from earlier structures, and even broken pottery were reused as aggregate in the construction of roads and other infrastructure. The Romans weren't just thinking about today, they were laying the foundation for a sustainable society that would support their empire for centuries. These reused materials didn't just serve practical purposes, they helped connect the vast expanse of the empire, creating a network that tied together cultures and regions from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Historians still argue over the motivations behind the Romans' recycling practices. Was it purely a matter of necessity in a resource-scarce world, or was it something more philosophical, a cultural mindset that valued the preservation and reuse of materials? Perhaps it was a combination of both. But one thing is certain. The Romans understood something vital that many of us are still learning today, that resources are limited, and the way we treat what we have has long-term consequences. The Romans didn't just recycle because they had to. They did it because they recognized the value of preserving what they had for future generations. Now, let's shift gears a little and look at how the impact of Roman recycling stretched beyond their own empire. As the Roman Empire expanded, so did the exchange of ideas and resources. Roman goods, including those made from repurposed materials, spread throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The influence of Roman craftsmanship and engineering was seen in everything from the design of Roman roads to the intricate mosaics and glasswork that became highly prized commodities. These practices were adopted and adapted by other cultures, helping to shape the way that recycling and resourcefulness were viewed in later civilizations. Even in the Middle Ages, when many of Rome's great achievements were forgotten or neglected, the principle of reusing materials persisted. When medieval builders needed to construct new churches or castles, they often turned to the ruins of Roman buildings for materials. Just like the Romans had once recycled their own structures, later generations found value in the remnants of Rome's grandeur. These Roman ruins weren't just old monuments to the past. They were a source of resources, a valuable pool of materials that could be repurposed to build the structures of the future. But the legacy of Roman recycling doesn't stop with the Middle Ages. In the modern world, we find ourselves grappling with many of the same questions that the Romans faced. How do we reduce waste? How do we make the most of limited resources? How do we preserve the past while also building for the future? The Romans, in their own way, were addressing these very questions over 2,000 years ago. And while we've made tremendous strides in recycling technology and waste management, the basic principles they employed still resonate today. Take, for example, the modern focus on sustainable construction. Today, we're more likely to see recycled materials in the construction of new buildings, reclaimed wood, repurposed metal, and even concrete made from broken bricks and stones. These are all practices that mirror the ancient Roman way of thinking. The Romans might not have had the advanced technologies we have today, but they had something equally valuable, a mindset that viewed waste not as something to discard, but as something to rework and reinvent. The Romans didn't just leave behind architectural marvels and works of art. They left behind a way of thinking about resources that's still relevant today. In their recycling of materials, they weren't just being practical. They were laying the foundation for a cultural and philosophical approach to sustainability that would endure long after their empire had fallen. As we leave behind the world of ancient Rome, let's take a moment to appreciate how the Roman legacy of recycling has shaped the way we think about our environment today. They were far ahead of their time, and we are still learning from their ingenuity and resourcefulness. Whether it's turning a broken pot into a mosaic or reusing the stone from a crumbling building to construct something new, the Romans showed us that there is value in everything. Nothing is truly disposable, and that's a lesson that we can all take with us into the future. As we draw closer to the end of our journey through the fascinating world of Roman recycling, let's take a moment to look at the broader cultural implications of all this. We've seen how the Romans turned waste into valuable materials and created a sustainable, resource-conscious society. But beyond the physical act of recycling, there was a deeper, more philosophical approach to the way the Romans interacted with their resources, their land, and their environment. Their entire worldview was shaped by the belief that everything, whether it was a broken pot, a discarded piece of metal, or even a crumbling building, could have a second life. The value wasn't just in the item itself, but in how it could be transformed, renewed, and repurposed for the future. Think about how this attitude permeated every aspect of Roman life. It wasn't just about fixing a broken vase or turning shattered glass into jewelry. It was about seeing the potential in everything. This mindset extended far beyond the practical uses of everyday items. It influenced their approach to art, to their cities, and even to their philosophy. The idea that nothing should be wasted wasn't just a matter of practicality. It was a reflection of Roman values. Their belief in transformation, in making the most out of what was available, became central to the culture. And this mindset gave rise to some of the most extraordinary architectural and artistic achievements of the ancient world. Imagine standing in the middle of Rome, gazing up at the majestic buildings that surrounded you. The marble columns of the great temples and forums were often made from stone and materials that had been repurposed from older structures. The intricate mosaics on the floors and walls of Roman homes and public baths were often made from fragments of pottery, glass, and stone. The Romans didn't see broken things as failures. They saw them as raw material for something new. This ability to see potential in what others might discard was an essential part of Roman creativity. Historians often point to this as one of the reasons the Romans were so successful at building their empire. They didn't just conquer territories and cities, they transformed them. They didn't just build monuments to their power, they recycled and reused the remnants of their empire, keeping everything in circulation and giving it new meaning. This cycle of renewal and reuse was integral to the Roman worldview, which viewed time itself as cyclical, ever repeating, ever renewing. The Romans didn't just take from the world around them, they gave back by constantly reinventing what had come before. And yet, this approach was not without its challenges. Recycling, after all, can only go so far. There were limitations to how much could be reused, and eventually, the empire reached a point where it could no longer maintain the same level of reuse and repurposing. As the empire expanded, so too did the need for more resources that weren't always easily available. The Roman Empire, in its final years, was stretched thin by constant warfare, economic strain, and the challenges of managing such a vast territory. But even in these difficult times, the legacy of Roman recycling persisted. Their commitment to preserving and repurposing, to making the most out of what they had, remained a hallmark of their culture. It's tempting to imagine a world where the Romans could have continued their practices of sustainability and resourcefulness indefinitely. But even the greatest civilizations face their limits. What we can take from the Romans, however, is not just their methods of recycling, but their underlying philosophy. The idea that everything has value, that every resource is worth preserving, and that even in the face of scarcity, creativity and ingenuity can help find a way forward. As we look at the world today, we face many of the same challenges the Romans did. How to manage resources effectively, how to reduce waste, and how to build a sustainable future. In many ways, the Romans have already shown us the path. They may not have had the same scientific understanding we do now, but their approach to recycling and reuse was founded on a deeply sustainable mindset that remains just as relevant today. It's a mindset that sees value in the smallest scrap of material, the simplest piece of waste, and transforms it into something of use and beauty. In fact, if we look closely, we can see echoes of Roman recycling in many modern practices, whether it's the creation of sustainable architecture, the use of recycled materials in manufacturing, or the growing global movement toward sustainability. We can trace our modern efforts back to the ancient practices of Rome. The Romans didn't just teach us how to recycle, they taught us how to think about the world in a way that sees waste not as an inevitable byproduct, but as an opportunity to innovate. So, as we close the book on this journey through Roman recycling, let's consider the larger picture. The next time you think about throwing something away, remember the Romans. Think about the way they transformed broken glass into jewelry, shattered pottery into mosaics, and ancient ruins into new buildings. They understood, long before we did, that nothing is ever truly wasted. And perhaps as we continue to tackle our own challenges with waste, we can take inspiration from their example, a reminder that everything has value, and that with a little creativity and care, anything can be repurposed. As we reach the final stages of our exploration of Roman recycling, let's pause to take stock of just how far-reaching the Romans' influence on sustainability truly went. We've walked through the streets of ancient Rome, seen the ingenious ways they repurposed everything from broken pottery to worn-out sandals, and marveled at their sophisticated waste management systems. But even as we look back at these practices, it's important to acknowledge that the Romans didn't just leave behind a legacy of ingenuity. They left behind a cultural blueprint for how to live sustainably, even in the face of vast empire building and resource depletion. Imagine the Romans, seated in their grand villas or in bustling forums, surrounded by artifacts, sculptures, and structures made from repurposed materials. The idea that the Romans recycled, not just for necessity, but also as a form of cultural identity, is a fascinating one. They didn't just reuse materials because they were cheap or scarce. They saw the value in preserving what they had, in renewing and reintegrating things that had been discarded. This wasn't a practice of inconvenience. It was a philosophy of respecting the past while preparing for the future. Whether through the reuse of bricks, stone, or metal, every piece was part of a greater, ongoing narrative. In fact, historians still debate whether the Romans' approach to recycling was uniquely tied to their practical lifestyle, or whether it had a deeper, more philosophical significance. Could it be that their perpetual recycling was a reflection of their understanding of time itself? Roman culture was imbued with the idea that history was cyclical, that the past would eventually return, and that everything, every material, every building, every discarded item had its place in the ongoing flow of time. This belief, perhaps, is why they felt compelled to reuse materials and preserve what had come before. The very foundations of their empire were built on a kind of eternal renewal. Think about this. Every time the Romans rebuilt a structure from reclaimed stone or reused an old statue for new artistic expression, they were participating in a cycle of regeneration. When we see the ruins of Roman cities today, these remnants of the past aren't just relics. They're a reminder of an empire that understood how to use its resources, how to draw on history, and how to keep things in motion. These ruins, these broken pieces, continue to speak to us even after centuries of time. Much like the mosaics made from broken pottery, these ruins tell a story of what once was and what could be again. Now, as we turn our gaze to the future, it's clear that the same principles of resourcefulness, recycling, and renewal that the Romans championed are as relevant today as ever. The modern world, in all its complexity, faces the same challenges that Rome did: how to manage waste, how to reuse materials, and how to build for a future where resources are limited. Today, as we recycle, repurpose, and strive for sustainability, we are following in the footsteps of the Romans, who, thousands of years ago, were already laying the groundwork for what we would call environmental consciousness. Today's recycling programs, sustainable farming practices, and green building initiatives are all built on ideas that have ancient roots. Whether it's using reclaimed materials in construction, creating art from recycled goods, or utilizing waste for productive purposes, these practices echo the resourceful spirit of Roman society. The ancient Romans didn't have the scientific knowledge we have today, but they understood, perhaps instinctively, that the health of a civilization depended on its ability to make the most of what it had. Now, as we wrap up our time here in the world of Roman recycling, we can't help but feel a sense of awe at their approach. The Romans didn't waste what was available to them. They turned it into something of lasting value. Their ingenuity wasn't just in their ability to conquer lands or build empires. It was in their ability to recognize that everything, no matter how small or seemingly useless, had worth. Whether it was a shard of pottery or a broken column, the Romans knew that there was always something to be salvaged, something to be transformed. And perhaps the greatest lesson we can take from the Romans isn't just in how they repurposed materials. It's in their understanding of the importance of sustainability, of viewing resources as finite and valuable. In a world where waste often feels like an inevitability, the Romans remind us that there is always another way, that we can create value from what we already have, and that every object, no matter how small, has a story to tell. As you reflect on the world of ancient Rome and their remarkable ability to recycle and repurpose, take a moment to think about how you, too, can carry on this legacy, whether it's through reducing waste, reusing materials, or simply appreciating the value in things others might discard. You are following in the footsteps of a civilization that understood the timeless art of transformation. Just like the Romans, we can all play our part in keeping the cycle of renewal going, turning waste into something useful, something beautiful, and something that will last long after we are gone. As we come to the final chapter of our journey through Roman recycling and sustainability, let's pause for a moment to reflect on the lasting impact of these ancient practices. When we think about Rome, it's easy to imagine grand spectacles, the towering aqueducts, the Colosseum, and the sweeping grandeur of the Roman Empire. But as we've seen in these past sections, the true brilliance of Rome lies not just in their military prowess or architectural wonders, but in their ability to look at what they had, repurpose it, and create something that could endure through time. The Romans were, in many ways, the first to understand that sustainability isn't just about using resources wisely. It's about preserving what we already have for future generations. The empire's legacy of recycling wasn't about throwing things away, it was about transformation. The act of taking something old, something worn, and giving it a second life wasn't just a practical solution, it was a cultural ethos. The Romans didn't simply repair their broken pots or reuse their old stone, they reimagined them. Every scrap of material, every discarded object was seen as part of an ongoing story of renewal. Now, as we find ourselves in the modern world, dealing with the challenges of overconsumption and waste, there's much we can learn from the Romans. We may have more technology, more knowledge, and more advanced systems, but the underlying principles they practiced, conserving resources, reimagining waste, and preserving the past for the future, are just as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. The Romans' legacy shows us that sustainable living isn't a new concept. It's something that has always been with us, and it's up to us to carry it forward. Think about the impact that recycling had on Roman society. In an empire as vast as Rome, recycling wasn't just a matter of saving money, it was essential to the survival of the empire itself. As cities expanded and resources grew scarce, finding ways to repurpose, reuse, and recycle was vital for keeping the wheels of the empire turning. The Romans didn't just rely on their conquests and riches, they relied on their ingenuity. Their cities, roads, and homes were built not just with new materials, but with materials that had already been given a new life. This idea of renewal became embedded in Roman culture and urban planning. Now, imagine the influence of this mindset. The Romans didn't just throw away things they didn't need. They saw potential in everything. Broken glass became a work of art. Cracked pottery became a floor mosaic. And the remnants of old buildings weren't demolished and discarded. They were reworked, reused, and given a new purpose. This is what allowed Roman cities to grow, thrive, and leave such a lasting mark on history. They had the foresight to turn even their waste into something enduring. As we look toward the future, we face similar challenges. How do we manage our resources wisely? How do we address the ever-growing mountain of waste that our modern world produces? The answer, in many ways, lies in the lessons of Rome. It's about seeing the value in what we have, repurposing what's discarded, and turning what others might throw away into something that can be used again and again. Just as the Romans transformed their waste into art and infrastructure, we can transform our own discarded materials into solutions for the future. Think about modern recycling programs where glass bottles are melted down, plastic is reused, and even food waste can be composted into rich soil. In many ways, we're replicating the Roman way of thinking, transforming what was once considered useless into something valuable and functional. But just as Rome faced challenges in managing its vast empire, we too face the challenge of turning our practices of resourcefulness into a global movement. It's a reminder that sustainability isn't just an option, it's a necessity. Like the Romans, we must embrace a mindset that values the things we have, that sees potential in what others discard, and that understands that the future depends on how we manage our resources today. So, as we close the book on the Roman Empire and the legacy of recycling, take a moment to consider how you can contribute to this ongoing cycle of renewal. Whether it's reusing materials in your daily life, supporting sustainable practices, or simply reducing waste in your own home, you are playing a part in continuing the story of resourcefulness that the Romans began. Their world was built on the principle of making the most of what they had, and it's a principle we can still build on today. In the end, the true lesson of Roman recycling isn't just about the materials they reused or the methods they employed, it's about the mindset they embraced. It's about recognizing that everything, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, has value. The Romans understood that no resource was ever truly spent, and neither should we. In a world that is constantly changing, we can look back to the past, to the lessons of the Romans, and find a path forward, one that reimagines, repurposes, and reinvents for a future that will last just as long as the ancient empire. And find a path forward, one that reimagines, repurposes, and reinvents for a future that will last just as long as the ancient empire itself. Sweet dreams. Good night.